Buenas tardes, students, teachers, and the generally curious. Welcome to another episode of the Constitution of American Life with us, the Friends of Publius. We are, as I like to say, the usual suspects, and we'll start with our world traveler, fresh back from lighting Europe on fire, Professor J. Michael Williams, rocking his Trinity. Is it Trinity College? I think it's Trinity College or Trinity University.
College, yeah.
Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, where you can go see the Book of Kells. Pretty exciting stuff. We have from his office, with surrounded by many old dusty books, which would say hopefully we'll be there. We'll see. And a little Jimmy Madison over his shoulder. We got Professor Timothy Moore from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Got to get that title proper. Got to be the proper title here. And we have our bus driver from the Diamond Spot of California, Bakersfield, California, one Mr. David Richmond, or as we like to call him, our bus driver. I'm Chris Kavanaugh, coming to you from the Northern Plains, and where the Northern Lights have been active the last couple of nights. Took some great photos last night. Pretty exciting Mother Nature's light show. No cover charge, no 2-drink minimum. It's a fantastic way to spend an evening watching lights dance around. And trying to understand or not understand the science behind it. Well, I obviously have the pleasure of doing our introduction this evening, and I tell you, for a week, my abstract random mindset, which is clearly the way I think, very abstract, very random. I've been all over the place about what to do for introduction. Earlier this week, I found out about a story about Kurt Vonnegut's classic Slaughterhouse-Five being banned in North Dakota. And in 1973, and they actually burned books. They burned about 35 copies of Slaughterhouse-Five at a school that will remain nameless. And Kurt Vonnegut, a great American writer, actually wrote a letter to the superintendent, and it was a private letter, but it was very interesting. So that sent me down a rabbit hole to think about banned books and burned books and the history of in the United States. And I thought that would be fun. And then I got distracted because I've been reading this book called Wisdom Takes Work by Ryan Holiday. And it's about the Stoics, the Stoic philosophers. And it's the last one in a series with the four Stoic virtues, and wisdom being one of them. Fantastic read. I mean, because he's using Lincoln, he's using Seneca, Michel de Montaigne about the idea of wisdom. Some of it made me feel good, because one of the things I try to teach my students, the first step to wisdom is raising your hand and asking questions, and going all the way back to Socrates and Plato, and those guys weren't the Stoics, but more so like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, kinds of things. So I was thinking, oh, maybe I can work that in somehow, but then I got sidetracked on that. So I'm going from like Vonnegut and book burning to Stoic philosophers. And then I saw a clip with Martin Sheen, and I remembered a poem that I saw him recite one time, the actor Martin Sheen. Some of you may know him better as Jed Bartlett from The West Wing. But I saw this poem, or I thought of this poem that he had read, and I was like, oh my gosh, that is just fantastic. And he had it memorized. And so this is what I'm going to go with this evening is a poem. And it's written by Rabindranath Tagore. And Rabindranath Tagore, 1861 to 1941, was considered a great Indian writer, from Bengali poet, novelist. He was a Nobel laureate in 1913. He was also, the Western world was kind of, I don't know, say turned off by him, because they saw him as a mystic. And so it was like his literature and writing was not that great. But I really was drawn to him also because he's a reformer, and he was a critic of colonialism, the colonialism that existed in India. So my words of wisdom this week are simply a poem, and it's also a prayer. So bear with me. The title is Where the Mind is Without Fear. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. And I thought that that poem is so good and so applicable to right now. So I will leave you with those words, where the mind is without fear, Rabindranath Tagore. For those of you interested, it is spelled Tagore. And I will put a link to this into the show notes. Excellent poem. So, gentlemen, this evening, going backwards in time to one of the things I was interested in, the 4 Stoic virtues are, let me make sure I get this right. They are wisdom, they are courage, they are justice, and they are temperance. And for students, temperance is the idea of moderating yourself, self-control, right? Balance, the idea of that. Justice, we know what justice is, being fair towards everybody. We talk about justice quite a bit on this program. Courage. Courage is the moral courage, right? Not just bravery in battle, but the fortitude to face adversity, right? Make difficult decisions and hardships. And wisdom, the ability to discern what's good and evil and different. Gentlemen, you have 4 Stoic virtues. Which one out of those 4, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, would you rank number 1 and why? And David, we'll start with you this evening.
I took a while for me to kind of play this out in my mind, but I decided to go with courage in my short argument because we could spend the entire hour talking about these 4 Stoic virtues. But my sense is that the other 3, to a certain degree, depend upon courage, as you described, moral courage. And I believe we live in a time in which we have a kind of an epidemic of the absence of courage, especially by those in leadership. So I'll go with courage.
Okay, very good. Professor Moore.
Um, I think that I would take a different tack on the times in which we live. I think moderation seems to be, if we want to make it applicable to now, I think we live in an age of excessive noise, excessive opinion, excessive ignorance, um, excessive everything. So I think moderation, I would say it's becoming difficult in an age of excess. So I would say temperance. And I do agree. I like David's framing of courage, maybe the umbrella for the others, but I think temperance and kind of I've always been accused of being um,
Temperate.
well, there are windows of my life where that's not been the case. But in the last 20 or so, some people have wondered if I have a pulse at times. So, temperance, I go there.
All right. Professor Williams.
Yeah, this is such a good question, and I would Ryan Holiday. There's another book he wrote called "The Obstacle Is the Way" that I'm not sure if you're familiar with, and yeah, I'll put a link in our show notes, and it's one of these. It's a overall kind of book. I've read it now 3 times, and I find myself every morning because the chapters are like 3 pages, and every morning I'll just read one of those. He also has a podcast called The Daily Stoic. That's okay. It's not great, but so for students, if you're interested in learning more about Stoicism, which you probably should, thank you, Chris, for that. It's good. I agree with David and Tim. I'm going to go with justice only because um, it the other 3 to me focus on your individual behavior, which I think is you can't do justice without focusing on individual behavior. But I like justice because it's also outward. It's outward thinking and it's thinking about others. You can live a temperate, I think, life with maybe not caring about others around you. So I'm going to go with justice just because I think it relates to how you treat other people.
So it's outward looking as opposed to working on
So
yourself.
that's the way I would interpret it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, for the sake of argument, I'm going to go with wisdom because I have been reading this book and it's been fascinating. And students, I'll just leave you with this: the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad.
Good.
So, Mr. Richmond, Professor Richmond, I'm handing the wheel to the bus. The wheels on the bus go round and round.
Well, I got 2 out of 3 right. I knew Tim would choose temperance. I knew Mike would choose justice. I thought you would follow Mike and choose justice there, Chris.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
honestly, I think David, I think your assessment about courage is being the umbrella because that really is. I think the way you worded that is very good.
Yeah.
But I do think that all four are. It's hard to have. It's hard to exist without or all four, or try to exist at least. Those are all. Let's say they're all aspirational for everyone. I think.
Well, if there's still classrooms out there, which I know there are in the We the People world, that like critical thinking and discussion, to me, this is a great kind of discussion generator there to talk about. So, welcome again to all the We the People peeps and the generally desperate for irreverent or irrelevant entertainment to episode 18 of the summer fall season of the Constitution of American Life, where the Friends of Publius attempt to take you down the nostalgic road of constitutional memory, or better known as the way we were before 2016. Since we last presented to students and teachers, an important event occurred. The Los Angeles Dodgers won their second World Series in a row, defeating a much better team in the Toronto Blue Jays. I will say honestly, being a lifelong Dodger fan, that my reaction to the victory was ambivalent at best, but I will also acknowledge that it was one of the most entertaining sporting events I have viewed in my 67 years, especially Game 6 and 7. And I really believe, whether it was divine intervention, luck, or whatever, the Dodgers beat a better team, and it was a highly entertaining World Series. So we're already planning for next year. I believe all 5 of us, and Mike's hoping to come out of the minor leagues. They did hire a college coach there, so you guys might be able to battle in AAA this year coming up.
David, all 5 of us?
All 5 of us. Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Oh, you haven't met my imaginary friend.
Oh,
okay. I'm sorry. I'll have to talk
Harvey.
about that
Harvey?
later. Did I say
Is his
5?
name Harvey?
Yeah. Very good. Not only focus there. So today we are going to focus our entire time on the bad news bears of the ratification process, the Anti-Federalists. For Professor Tim Moore, this is better than a trip to Disneyland as a boy, which requires us, of course, to begin our discussion with the poster child of the Anti-Federalist fan club, Professor Moore. So Tim, whether it was disdain of the British system or love affair with the Articles, wasn't the anti-Fed opposition to the Constitution built upon a general disdain of the plan rather than specific clauses? Just conceptually, they just didn't want anything to do with it, or was it a detail by detail kind of thing, in your opinion?
Well, I think there is a lot of nitpicking that the Anti-Federalists do, and I think that's easy to do, whether it's debating a constitution or debating an architectural design of a building, or what's the old joke about if you want to delay something, give it to a committee. So there is a lot of nitpicking. I think I would say though that the Anti-Federalist and I would say there's a range here, suspicion to disdain, and I think there's all kinds of anti-federalists along that spectrum. I think in general, they're not so much afraid. They're not so much espousing the glories of the articles, because most Americans know that the articles need revision, that they're deficient. There's only a few anti-federalists that went so far as to say articles great, and generally their argument is boiled down to a couple and it would be hard to say this with a straight face, but they said, hey, the articles got us through the war. It can't be all that bad. Well, the retort to that is, well, not really, because the articles weren't operative until 81, and we're close to the end of the war at that point. So, hey, articles got us through the war. Let's not, there were a few that said give it a few more years. This will level out. There were a few that said that the folks that created the articles were better, more virtuous than the people that created the Constitution. But by and large, there's a disdain for and fear of the British system, more so than a love of the articles. And so I think, there were a few anti-federalists that said, look, the articles. Well, there was another argument that we need to give them a little more time, and also there's a few anti-federalists said that the nationalists were making the crisis worse than it actually was. And that's where I think history plays into, the Federalists get a lot of mileage out of Shays and the other agrarian revolts. So the Anti-Federalists have a general disdain for the British consolidation. That's what they see, and not out of any great love of the articles, because they know it needed to be tweaked. And we're in favor of the convention so long as they were supposed to go to tweak the articles, not necessarily create a whole new constitution. So,
well, I appreciate that you mentioned, the Federalists kind of as nationalists and wanting, again, I think it's kind of a glue to create a nation, all right, a national identity. So I'm wondering, was there going to be any constitution, any design that comes out of Philadelphia in which the Anti-Federalists would be happy with, if indeed its intent was to create a national union?
Man, that's a great counterfactual. That's a lesson. Create a constitution that the Anti-Federalists would have liked. Now, I would say maybe. Sorry.
No.
Temperance.
Lacking that courage.
I'm lacking courage, right? Lacking
Or wisdom.
Or wisdom. I'll say, yeah, I think there would have been a constitution coming out of Philadelphia that they would have liked, but it would had to have incorporated a lot of the recommendatory amendments that play, and we might get to New York and Virginia later, but there were all kinds of recommendatory amendments made by conventions, and some of them were very, very structural alterations of the structure of the Constitution. In fact, in some cases, just obliterating parts of the Constitution. So, I think that kind of a constitution would have been okay. I don't know. I mean, that's a crystal ball question.
Right.
But the other thing is, if it would have come out with simple revisions, and I would say the revisions that were tried as amendments in the 80s that did not succeed, I think if the Philadelphia Convention would have incorporated those 6 attempts during the 80s, maybe the Anti-Federalists would have been okay with those.
I just thought of something, David. Your question is a great question about would the Anti-Federalists, what would they have said yes to? Why didn't they send anybody to Annapolis? I mean, why not show up to Annapolis and head this off with the pass?
Well, remember, Annapolis meets very, very quickly and shuts it down very, very quickly. And I think my reading of Annapolis is the folks there did not want a full convention. They didn't want to solve grandiose, because they were sent there to solve localized trade issues in and around the Potomac.
Right.
So I see Annapolis as they shut it down, they get Hamilton to write the report, and let's meet next year. So I don't know that Annapolis really had a chance to succeed, because they meet in a place where there aren't businessmen. It's not a central location for a lot of folks. There were a couple of delegations on the way that got there late, and the convention ends. So Annapolis is one of those curious. If you like conspiracies, the failure of Annapolis is a great thing to discuss. Whether it was
I would just think the Federalists would like, after the Philly's done and they send the document out and the Federalists could look at the antis and said, hey, y'all had a chance to show up to Annapolis and you chose not to, so you kind of forced us into this.
um I don't, there. Well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Anti-Federalists could say, sit down and shut up because you guys were sent to revise the articles. So don't come talk to us like we had a chance. You totally violated, I would say, 11 of the 12 sets of instructions that were given to you by your own states. So I think Anti-Federalists got some legitimate pushback on that.
Well, I would have said shoulda, coulda, woulda.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, the main question that students are asked to deal with draws from a quote by Sentinel, which touches upon the metaphor of the Trojan horse filled with soldiers. I'm wondering if you can provide a few examples of what specific dangers, all right, these Federalist soldiers presented to liberty in the newfound country.
I was thinking of this question. I kept thinking of the little green army man popping out. It's like not the Greeks. I was thinking these little green army guys like that. So, but yeah, Sentinel, he definitely has some complaints. I think one of those Tim kind of alluded to was they're worried about the annihilation of the states. He's worried about the states getting swallowed up, right? So I mean, reducing the economy. I think he talks about reducing the states to mere shadows. It's a really good language, I think, honestly. And then there's the Anti-Federalists' greatest hits, the lack of a Bill of Rights. The idea that you mentioned is liberty of press, right to trial by jury, which are legitimate complaints. I don't want to downplay that. Those are definitely legitimate complaints. But students, you guys realize one of the through line for the Anti-Federalists was that lack of a Bill of Rights in the new Constitution. Here's one. Abuse of congressional power. Yeah, we might get back to that later when he's worried about this idea of immense authority, the necessary and proper clause. My goodness, that really freaked him out. And then I know there's also, not only the necessary and proper clause, but the supremacy clause coupled together. I think Sentinel, as well as other Anti-Federalists, referred to the necessary and proper as a new declaratory act, right? Basically, Parliament, telling the colonists, our house, our rules kind of thing. We're going to do what we want. And I think Sentinel's pointing to the necessary and proper clause along with the supremacy clause as a new declaratory act. Inadequate checks and balances. Yeah, I think he said they were like merely nominal, right? So this idea that the Federalists are talking about separating out the powers. I don't think he was buying that. Potential for a standing army. This scared the bejesus out of him as well as other Anti-Federalists. They're very worried about the president becoming a new Caesar, right? And one of my favorite languages that he uses, he talks juggle the people out of their liberties, juggling the people, right? The amendment process he thought was inadequate, right, and make it nearly impossible for folks to correct an injury, right, that the government may carry out, and the secrecy. He was definitely not happy about the secrecy, right? That's where he talks about juggling the people out of their liberties by kind of forcing them to adopt this plan. So those are the little green army men that are hopping out of this Trojan horse. I think the Sentinel was talking about.
I was fascinated. I reread Sentinel over the weekend, and I was fascinated. And you camped out on the word, David, soldiers. I have, and the soldiers come out of the horse, and that in the ancient story. But I couldn't help but think that Anti-Federalists had great suspicions about the National Officer Corps of the Continental Army. In fact, they created a fraternal organization called the Society of the Cincinnati. And they were very suspicious of those folks, that National Corps of officers, soldiers, would spill out And in the future, the operators of this new system would be this cadre of national office, this officer corps. And that ties into the anti-elitist feelings of a lot of anti-federalists. So the soldier analogy that Sentinel uses, I think, is I couldn't help but think about Society of Cincinnati, which by the way are meeting in Philadelphia at the same time that the convention is going on. So that's one of the reasons that Washington thought about not going to the convention, because he was invited to speak to the Cincinnati at their convention. And so there was a lot of conspiracy theory about the Society of the Cincinnati, these soldiers that would overthrow and juggle people's liberties. Yeah.
So Chris part of me sees this as hyperbole. But I'm wondering, is their concern rooted in the language of the document that comes out of Philadelphia, or is it more so a lack of trust in the ability of man to govern themselves, or because obviously the system relies somewhat on virtue? All right, is it their lack of faith in the virtue of mankind and the inherent badness or evilness of mankind? Where do you tilt on that? Or is it just
I think certainly, I mean, he does point to certain clauses, right, like the necessary and proper. So there are provisions in there. Commander-in-Chief clause, they're worried about the whole idea of the president, and the soldiers that Tim was alluding to. Even though I think I don't think anybody is going to openly question Washington's loyalty. I mean, you're not going to go after the great man. So I think there is a level of pointing to specific passages, right? Because you got to hang your argument on. But I think you're also, David, you're right. There's a 30,000-foot view about virtue, and we can be virtuous at the state level, but when you annihilate the states, as he was fearful of, right, turning them into mere shadows, and now all of a sudden you've removed his seat of government further away. The more out of sight, out of mind kind of the government becomes, the less virtuous they become. So I think it's a combination of both. I think it's a combination of finding specific language that they're hanging their arguments on, Sentinel as well. But they're also the fear of we're virtuous in our state. You guys in those other states, we don't know about you guys in those other states. And now you're going to take our power, the sovereignty, our state sovereignty away, give it to this national government. I don't think we can, that feeling is we don't believe that they can be virtuous because they're going to be too far removed from the people. They're not going to be answerable to the people.
Sentinel's a populist. I mean, there's a great book written years ago by Saul Cornell that laid out this argument that there's a spectrum of anti-federalists. Sentinel is one of those rootin' tootin', flame-throwing, name-calling anti-federalists. So he's going to use hyperbole. I mean, to your point, David. Sentinel, he's from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Sorry, I had to get that in. So he's coming from a populist resentment of elite control. He's very different than Federal Farmer or Brutus. So I think his framework of populism, I think, plays into the suspicion of elites and the wariness of governing elites.
Well, I guess I come at this and I look at the language. I mean, you said federalism. Well, those powers are, I don't want to get to the 10th Amendment, but there's specific limitations on a national government within the language. And as you say, the necessary and proper clause, but the necessary and proper clause, as specifically read, says they only have that power related to the foregoing other 17 clauses. So it's not, at least the language of it is not open-ended, one could argue there. So that's why I think it's a little hyperbole there.
Okay, but again, he's a populist. But you, David, you know as well as anybody, your articulation of what the 10th Amendment or the necessary and proper clause means is one of the perspectives. The other perspective is it is an open-ended carte blanche. So
yeah, I had to twist myself into a knot to come out with that a little bit.
And then when you have a Mr. Hamilton who is talking about implied powers, right?
Yeah.
The implied powers, and even though they're trying to tell people, oh no, just the enumerated powers, right? And Hamilton's, hinting at this concept of implied powers, and you throw in the supremacy clause with that too. Yeah, because I think a lot of different anti-federalists hung out on necessary and proper.
Yeah.
So, Professor Moore, I don't know why I shouldn't have been surprised, but in prepping for this, I was somewhat surprised that the call for a second convention came from Virginia and New York. Now, New York, I'm not too surprised. Virginia, I was somewhat surprised there. So I'm wondering, what specific issues did these two states? Is it just because they're large states? They're probably two of the most powerful states economically. What specific problems did these two states have with the Constitution of 1787? And why, in the end, did the call for a second convention fail to materialize?
Well, it actually starts at Philadelphia. A Virginian, Randolph, proposes that their work in Philadelphia be reviewed by a second convention. Now, that goes nowhere at Philadelphia, but the germ of a second convention actually starts at Philadelphia. Now, I would say, in a way, it's not surprising that Virginia and New York later in 88 lead the charge, uh, because they're late. I mean, 7.5 states have approved the Constitution by the time New York and Virginia meet. So,
Wait, help me out. A half state?
yeah, New Hampshire. They had met. They adjourned because some of the Federalists at that convention were instructed to vote against. But during that convention, they wanted to vote in favor but couldn't. So they needed to go back home to get their instructions changed later in the summer, when they would reconvene at in a different city. It wasn't a different convention; it was an adjourned convention. So a lot of folks speculated that New Hampshire would be the eighth or ninth, and it was. So my point is, Virginia and New York are late. A lot of states have already ratified. So if there's going to be a continued rattle and hum about a second convention, it's really going to heat up after the Constitution has been officially ratified, and those two states are late. They're late. In fact, the country would exist without them with New Hampshire's ratification. So, so in a way, it's the short answer is timing, David. They really kick in late in the summer of mid.
And why is that?
A lot of times it has to do with state legislatures don't meet. And state legislatures had to call for and set up elections for the ratification convention. So a lot of states, their legislatures aren't in session until the spring of 88. So some of it has to do with legislative calendar, but also some of it has to do with the other states preceding those other states in getting their conventions done earlier.
So in the world of speculation, which I know you love, you could play around as a student on this and argue that if Virginia and New York had been early in the process of calling it, there might have been a greater chance of success.
Oh, I think the anti-federalist sentiment in those powerful states is very strong. Yeah, I would play along with that counterfactual lesson. Absolutely. Now you had the second part of your question is why it ultimately.
Why did it fail to materialize?
I think some of it is steam, bandwagon. There's 8 states already ratified. I think some of it is the disorganization of anti-federalists from state to state. I mean, there's a wonderful piece that appeared in a lot of newspapers in the spring of 88. It was making fun of anti-federalists. It said, let's do, it literally, I think, was titled Mathematics. 13 states, 47 recommendations in Massachusetts, 27 in this, 27, and it just kind of pokes fun at how wide and varied and these proposed amendments were, and there's some anti-federalists that are rootin' tootin', and there's some that are more reasonable. Okay, let's let the first Congress create these amendments. So the disorganization, I think, plays into it as well, and I think most people were comfortable with the recommendations coming in and the first Congress. I mean, this was a part of what Madison was saying in the spring of in the spring of '88. You know, he was apoplectic about the possibility of a second convention, and a lot of his letters is over and over again. One of his letter to Randolph was recommending amendments as the only acceptable. Everything else is irreconcilable to sanity. He writes another letter. A second convention would be fatal, and just the disunionites would run roughshod over the nation. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, derailing this, the disorganization, and also I think the failure of an attempt in Pennsylvania, the what was called the Harrisburg Convention. Those were a bunch of crazies, and I think
Were they from the western part of the state? Are they your people?
they're central. They're central. They're
Oh,
central.
okay.
There's a lot of Federalist editors that have a field day with the Harrisburg Convention because there were some crazy people that went there. So it's easy to discredit a second, this second
Convention.
convention movement if you have a bunch of wackos associated with it. So I think the Harrisburg Convention may play into a little bit too.
Mike?
Yeah, no, Tim just checked me on this. As I'm following this, I hadn't thought about it. The very germ of what made an anti-federalist is kind of the downfall of them being able to coordinate across. It reminds me of the Occupy movement. I remember when the
Decentralization, right? Yeah,
yeah, it was this idea of not having any leaders as that being a key value structure to the movement.
Well, they
Which
had
actually-
leaders. They had some national leaders, but I think the nationalists, later Federalists, had more nationally known. And like Langton Smith, I mean, Patrick Henry's is a rock star around the country, but he sees himself as a localist too. So there's leadership, but there's not a national level leadership the way that the Federalist had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Professor Williams, although the Constitution allows for conventions to be called through Article 5, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong here, but we have never had another national convention to amend the Constitution. But numerous states have held constitutional conventions throughout history. How do you account for this disparity where we seem to have a plethora of conventions at the state level, but never a convention at the national level since 1787?
Yeah, and I couldn't find Tim and Chris. There hasn't been another national convention successfully called, right? I couldn't find one.
Unless you call the annual gathering of the Supreme Court.
Right.
First Monday in October, baby.
Yeah, right.
I mean, there's two separate questions. They're really good. So let's deal with like why one hasn't been called. It kind of feeds into the conversation we're just having. The coordination that it would take for 2/3 of the state legislatures to do it, students, that'd be about 34 states. There's just that takes a lot of coordination. So I think part of it is just a coordination issue. Second, I mean, the Constitution says nothing about how this would work, right? How is the agenda? What's the agenda would be? Who would run it? How would it be run? And I think that it doesn't take too many actors in this system to kind of think this could go haywire really, really quick. And it'd be risky to call a national convention without an agenda for the convention. Who knows what could be determined? So I think part of it is about risk. Feeding into that now, given where we're at in terms of our interest group participations in political parties, that risk is even amplified. There's going to be some important voices within the states who are going to make it more difficult for this to happen. I think there's a little bit of what we might call path dependency. Congress was the one that kind of got the process going with the Bill of Rights, and so from there, I think there was just a model for that Congress would be the one to vote it out and then send it to the states. And then separately, why states do it, I didn't know about this until I was doing some research on this week. There's about 14 states that in their constitutions mandate that either every 10 or 20 years, there's either a referendum or there's a vote taken on, should we change the Constitution? So I don't know. This is where I'm getting a little over my skis because I don't know as much about state cultures and state constitutions. It just seems like the culture and the values around state constitutions are that they're longer, they're more detailed, they're meant to be changed more frequently than the US Constitution was, even from the beginning. And then in practice, just that we've talked about this on this program, right? We don't have that muscle. The muscle memory of changing the Constitution is something that we haven't passed on. So I just think that it's at the states they have passed it on. Either it's required in these 14 states, or there's just more of a memory of it. And I also did look up, I know this wasn't part of your question. I was just looking up because we've talked about disproportionality with the Senate and with electoral college. You know, these 34 states, the 34 states with the least amount of population could get together. They would represent 31% of the US population, and they could go and hold a convention. I just looked it up this week. Of the 34 least populous states, 29 of those voted for President Trump in the last election. So it would only be in the 5 states that are on there that didn't, is like one's New Hampshire, one's Vermont. They're all kind of small. So I was just trying to see this through a partisan lens and seeing how much state legislatures have been doing what the national party wants with the gerrymandering stuff, and seeing how it's not completely outside of our partisan politics to see how this could be something that a national party would say, we will coordinate this for you. We will set the agenda, and let's hold a constitutional convention, right? To change some things that we don't like in the Constitution. It's, after doing this research, I didn't think it was going to be possible. It seems a little more probable and possible given our current politics than I had thought before.
Well, I want to the notion of setting the agenda. I mean, wouldn't that? I mean, obviously this would start somewhere, and in fact, there have been attempts, all right, in history to call a convention. I
Yeah.
know in the 90s there was one about a balanced budget, all right, going through a convention process for that versus the other process. And wasn't it just recently that Governor Newsom from California proposed a convention? Now, he had like 4 or 5 things on his agenda. One of them was gun violence
Right.
there. But, so I mean, doesn't that kind of help eliminate that barrier if indeed it starts in motion as we need a convention for this purpose?
I think so, but I think immediately what detractors would say is that there's no rule that says just because you call a convention on gun violence that when everyone gets there that's going to be the only issue. You talk about the Trojan horse. I mean, someone just moves. I don't know how this would work. I don't know if it'd be Robert's rules or what, but someone would just motion for, now let's put on the floor that we do this, and what would be the rules to stop that? I think that would be the counter argument of like anybody standing up and say, okay, let's have a convention on this one issue. What's going to be the guarantee it's going to be to the one issue? And then is that going to make it more complicated to coordinate all the states from buying in?
And we've had that experience.
Yeah, that's what happened at Harrisburg.
Yeah.
That's
well,
exactly
and what about Philadelphia, Tim? I mean, they call for a convention to amend.
Because
So
they're
how-
all nationalists at Philadelphia. They're all nationalists. There's no anti-federalists there. I mean, I mean, there's
Whoa, George Mason?
he's fine in the beginning. And as it goes on, Randolph, Mason, Gary, I mean, Gary's a great case study in flip-flopping. So my argument has always been they're all nationalists at Philadelphia.
What
So
about
it's easy
Lansing
to,
that leaves?
well, they're only sent there to keep Hamilton in line. So they,
Yeah,
I mean,
but
Dixie
they
Lansing-
were there and they left.
Right. As far as the agenda goes, at what point did they decide to abandon what they were called there to do?
Well,
That's very early on, right?
well, the irony is Madison writes the Virginia instructions, and they're to go to amend the articles, and at the same time he's writing his friend saying, "I have no interest in doing that. I'm showing up with the Virginia plan." So there's a great irony there. The movement starts before the convention, is what my answer would be, David.
I remember, one summer I'd been traveling and I got home and I had a call from our congressman as chief of staff, and So I went to meet with him, and that was during the time period for the balanced budget, where they're pushing for this balanced budget amendment, and they want to try and do it through convention. And so he was picking my brain about this, and I'm like, well, you know that you guys call this convention for this one purpose. It could be a Pandora's box, right? I use Pandora's box, a different piece of mythology. I was not thinking of the Trojan horse. So, and he's like, well, yeah, but we're going to give specific instructions that if you wander away from the purpose, and that is proposing the balanced budget amendment, then we are going to, the state legislature is going to bring charges against you somehow. I'm thinking, wait a minute, the state legislature is going to bring charges for somebody at a convention. And I'm saying, explain to me how this is going to work, because I'm not connecting all these dots. He goes, well, we're still working on that to try and keep people in line. So they're just voting on this. I said, well, you know, what happens the minute someone brings up term limits? What's the congressman fill in the blank? How's the congressman going to feel about term limits? And it was crickets. It's like, well, be ready.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, let's play a little Monday morning quarterback here. And in prepping for this, I went back and I found some interesting information about the teaching of the Constitution. And it really is the Bicentennial Commission and what's happening in that period of time. A lot of new looks are being developed about the Constitution, and not that that hadn't happened before. I believe in the 60s there was also a period, I don't know, we want to call it revisionism or whatever, but for the longest time it was taught that the Federalists won the debate. They're the victors in all of this over the adoption of the Constitution. But looking backwards and using your knowledge of history as a guide, who in your opinion was right about the benefits and or dangers of the Constitution? Monday morning quarterback.
Well, the Federalists won because we got the Constitution, right? So yeah, they're the winners of this debate. Were they right? Yes and no. I'm going to play my best professor more here. Maybe. It's kind of squishy. It's both. It's both. I think both sides has some very legitimate arguments and complaints. I mean, let's say the Federalists, we needed national stability and order. Our economy was in the crapper, obviously. We couldn't get it together to amend the articles to give the national government some greater power to borrow money, taxing. Checks and balances were nothing, and the government was not vigorous, we'll say, under the articles. So there's a degree of that. But the Anti-Federalists, yeah, we needed a Bill of Rights for sure. Their fear about consolidation of power, I think, has borne some fruit over the years. The consolidation of power, and I would argue more so after or going into the New Deal, beginning with the New Deal and the administrative agencies created under FDR. So you start to see a great shifting of power. This moved, it was maybe a glacial pace, has definitely sped up in terms of the shifting of power away from the states to the national government, this consolidation of power. And I think one of the complaints the Anti-Federalists had, and kind of alluded to it earlier, was the distance of representatives, right? And how you used to be able to know the people that represented you, and now with the growth of people, and now we have we get 700,000 people on average being represented by one representative. So the idea of getting to know your rep, getting to know your government, that distance has created distrust, I think. So I think the Anti-Federalists probably hitting the nail on the head on that one. And one more, the potentials for abuse of federal power. I mean, that's one of their big complaints, is their fear of this idea of this abuse of federal power. Starting maybe with the Alien and Sedition Acts going forward after that, right? So I think both sides had some serious right?
Well,
Right.
and again, I'm going to push back and a little bit. The whole Bill of Rights thing, I mean, they get credit, but we've talked about this. It's fairly irrelevant until
Well,
the Reconstruction period, and we get a 14th Amendment, which was what Madison wanted. I mean, he said, okay, we're going to do this. We need to have
no,
some of these things apply to the states.
no, negative, Ghost Rider. The pattern is full. I'm gonna say thank you, John Marshall and Barron versus Baltimore. We don't know this, that the Bill of Rights is not going to protect us from the states until the Supreme Court rules in a case later, right? That establishes that the Bill of Rights is not a protection from state governments, because there's, I mean, in my goodness, Jefferson wins and the Alien Sedition Acts go away, even though you could make a rightful case that perhaps they were unconstitutional, which of course leads us to a whole nother rabbit hole.
So you're saying that for 40 years, there's not a circumstance that comes up, because Barron is in the 1830s.
I know.
So for 40 years, nothing comes up for a citizen to challenge, all right, their state government in federal court.
I don't know.
I mean, we know the Alien Sedition laws, but nobody challenged, challenged the law in court, to my understanding.
No, I mean, it didn't happen because you had an election, right? You had an election, and then.
Well, there were a lot of people who suffered under those laws before that election of 1800.
Absolutely, absolutely. And which leads us to the rabbit hole I was thinking of was the nullification crisis that's going to appear later. And thank you, Thomas Jefferson, in your Kentucky resolution about nullification, right? Where Madison's more with the Virginia document more on interposition. But I'm saying that at the time, so the Bill of Rights is ratified, stealing the thunder from the Anti-Federalists, and we talked about this before. But at the time, they don't know that it's not going to protect you from state governments. They don't know that. I mean, that's not the reality on the ground. Now, is there something happened over that 40-year time period that you could argue that the state is taking away your rights? Maybe, but the states already had bills of rights. So you're more than likely going to use the amendments found in your state constitution as a protection from your state government.
Well, clearly Maryland didn't have a Fifth Amendment there for Mr. Barron.
They just didn't have a very good attorney arguing for the city of Baltimore. They had a great attorney arguing for the city of Baltimore, one Roger Taney.
So, and I did want to point out, on kind of the Federalist side, and people want to say, oh, this Constitution has lasted for 200 and something years now, and we're getting into another period of celebration of this, declaration to the Constitution, a 10-year period coming up here. And I just want to remind people, to me, the Civil War is evidence of the failure of that Constitution there. So it hasn't been 200 and something years; it's been 160 something years. One might argue that the Union has stayed together, because it didn't stay together under the original Constitution.
For one other thing I want to point out too is, and I'll put a link in the show notes to a good column written by David French, who's a columnist for the New York Times, and really talking about the pardon power. And he goes back and he's channeling some Anti-Federalist complaints about what's going to happen. George Mason at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, did warning about what's going to happen with pardon power, and we've seen this more recently in the last two administrations using a pardon power, and it's kind of like the Anti-Federalists are like, we told you this was going to happen. So I think the Anti-Federalists, back to your original question, they might have been more right than the Federalists.
Yeah. So, Professor Williams, this may be an unfair question, but those are my favorite types of questions here. I'm wondering, to what extent, if any, did the international, you're a comparativist, and we can stick to the 20th century if we want, but I'm just wondering, did the international community of the 19th and 20th century learn from the arguments of the Anti-Federalists? That is, especially late 19th century constitution making 20th century constitution making, they now have, one might say, the gold prize of democratic form constitutions in the American Constitution, and they've got this debate over it. Do they draw some lessons from the Anti-Federalists?
Yeah, it's a great question. I and like a lot of your questions, it gets me thinking, oh, I need to go down this rabbit hole a little bit more. And I couldn't find, I didn't have a lot of time this week to really get into this. I could not find a lot of documentary evidence that showed, when this country was writing their constitution, did they have the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates there? Like, were they referencing? I couldn't find that. But I do think it's clear based on what a lot of countries, especially in South America, have done, that the debates, I mean, these debates, as we've talked about on this show now for season after season, these debates between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists don't end. I mean, we are continuing with those debates. I mean, it's the through line of really who we are as a country, that we're in this marriage and we're fighting about the same thing over and over again, just different issues and different, but it's really just about where's power going to be located and how do we best form our communities. That's how I would kind of summarize what the big debate's about. And so, yes, sorry, go ahead, Tim.
No, it seems to me if you frame Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates in terms of national globalists, localists,
Yeah.
if you use that framework, it would seem to me that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists show up different terms in different places. But it seems to me there's always the question of, do we as a nation want to engage in global commerce? I mean, in that regard, the Federalists won that argument. Hamilton's plan ushers us into a global economy. Although all the way up to the Civil War, states really kind of are the dominant feature in how the governance works within our constitutional system.
Yeah.
So I think if you frame it localists versus globalists, maybe those arguments do resonate in other places. I don't
No,
know.
they do. No, I think you're right. I mean, I think you see it happening. Definitely the idea over like decentralization and local self-rule, right? I think you see Canadians, folks in
Oh yeah.
Switzerland, Germany, India, they have really, even how the EU is structured, right? They have learned something from the Anti-Federalists with that. I think in Latin America, a lot of time was taken thinking about how do we create an executive branch that is not too powerful. And Mexico is probably the best example. What they came up with structurally was that presidents could serve 1 6-year term and never be reelected again. That was their answer to this idea of how do we make sure, if we need an executive that's going to be more than ceremonial, how do we make sure that person isn't going to be there for long periods of time? So those two things for sure. Um, I do think that we can debate over whether we needed it or who should get credit for the Bill of Rights, but this idea of having a Bill of Rights at the front of your document is something I think that becomes the model to which other countries then adopt in the 19th and 20th centuries. Um, Now, some things that I guess I would say, while maybe they debated this over design, the things that went the other way was like the role of courts. I think you find throughout the developed world right now that the courts are playing much stronger role than the Anti-Federalists would have been comfortable with. And just the concentration of power now in central governments, even if by design they didn't want it, I think you see that happening in more places now than not. So it's a great question. And as I've been using this season to think through a project on comparing South Africa and the United States a little more a little more kind of the side by side comparison. And I have in my notes now to look and see if at the South African Constitutional Convention, how much did they is there any evidence of anyone talking about the Anti-Federalists versus the Federalists? So I'll have to check back in with you guys in about a year when I figure that out. But thank you, David.
You might look for people that are like supporting that decentralized agrarian economy versus people
For sure.
like Hamilton. Let's assume those state debts to give us the fiscal power.
Yeah.
I think those ideas that we may not label them, but I think those ideas are still relevant to this day. I mean,
Yeah.
within our own country, I think also within other countries too. Like, and
Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Michael. Who's got the power and at what time?
Yeah.
So, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our conversation here on Unit 2, question on the Anti-Federalists. So it is your opportunity to provide final thoughts, feedback, recommendations for students and teachers. Professor Moore, I know you've been giddy this entire hour.
I know I can't speak. No, I think you're going to get with this question, you're going to get the judge or two that's going to say, can you give us an example of the Federalists today? Can you give us an example of the Anti-Federalists? So think, well, I mean, I think those are fair questions. You also, so be prepared for those. I think I think the dangerous question that you'll likely get is which party today is the Federalist, which party is the Anti-Federalist. And the short answer is there's too much history. There's not a straight line between Federalists and Party A and Anti-Federalists and Party B. There's too much history to get involved with that because at times they behave very different than how the party did, 40, 50, even 100 years ago. So don't fall for that one. But I think these debates, to Mike's point, these debates do occur even within our country as well as maybe internationally. Centralized power versus decentralized power, I think, really is the crux of the matter here to think through.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, start listening to Tim. I would agree with what he said and understand it's one thing to be the party out of power, but when you become the party in power, are you consistent, right? Are you consistent in your viewpoints on certain things? And I think of Jefferson being out of power and now Jefferson in power. There might be a consistency issue there. I don't know. Far be it for me to throw the great man under the bus, but I'm happy to. For students, I think it's important. I think for your Unit 1 folks as well. Don't think in terms of modern political parties. Think, am I a natural rights guy or am I a classical Republican person? Am I a Federalist or am I an Anti-Federalist? And so start to think about where you put ideas and channel my inner political scientist. What bucket are you going to put these ideas into? To start to think your thinking. So when you start thinking about rules or what you're dealing with locally at your school, does it sound more like a Federalist argument or more like an Anti-Federalist argument?
Mm-hmm.
So start thinking about things like that to change your thinking. So when you get these questions, you're already kind of thinking about it. Something else for you to think about too, and we kind of alluded to it in the show tonight. What's your state do in terms of your Constitution? Mike alluded to states that have it written in there about changing their Constitution. Know how you change your Constitution. Know how your state Constitution reflects the will of the people, right? So know what's happening, because we all know that that's really the level of government that we have the most action with. Your state government, for all the students that watch this, your state government is one that really determines what happens in the classroom. So know your state Constitution as well.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, and this is related to what Tim and Chris already said. I would encourage you to talk amongst yourselves about what do you think the Federalists saw as the purpose, the overall purpose of government? How is that different than the Anti-Federalists? And then amongst yourself, ask yourself that question, because I think that will lead, if you're going to have I was listening to some podcast, and maybe it was with David French and Jamel Bowie, and they're joking around how they're nerds, how they have a Google sheet on their computer with their proposed amendments, right? That they add to it and they take away. And I do think students, I do think we're at a time in American history where I think it's plausible in your generation that we will see a movement to change the Constitution, at least some targeted amendments. So as you're thinking through your amendments, I would encourage you to think through, what do you think the purpose of government is, and how do the amendments flow from that?
Well done, gentlemen. I don't think I have much to offer to those insights. Students, I hope that you were able to see an example of wisdom, courage, and temperance in our discussion, and maybe some injustice every now and then, or justice, absence. I don't know what it is. When we come back together in our next session, you need to let your Unit 4 colleagues know this. We're going to be dealing with Unit 4. I believe it is question 1, but we've kind of revised it. It was the general consensus of the friends here that question was just very narrowly tailored, and we want to kind of broaden out the discussion about Congress. We promise that we will address the key theme to that question there. So we'll be dealing with Congress from Unit 4. Until then, peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye bye, bye bonds.